It's a Sunday morning in August 1961, and the people of Berlin are waking up to a city that no longer exists. Not physically. The buildings are still standing exactly where they stood the day before. The streets still run where they always ran. The church spires still mark the same skyline. The cafes on either side of the old dividing lines are still serving the same coffee they served on Saturday. But sometime in the black hours before dawn, soldiers with coils of barbed wire and trucks loaded with concrete fence posts moved through the city and cut it in half, street by street, crossing by crossing. And by the time the sun came up, roughly 60,000 people who crossed that line every single day to go to work, to visit a grandmother, to buy shoes that were actually in stock, discovered they could no longer cross it at all. You've heard this story before, and you've heard it told a specific way. You've heard it as an ideological story, a story about a communist state sealing itself off from the temptations of the free world, about a dictatorship afraid of what its own citizens might see if they kept being allowed to look west and compare. And that story isn't false, exactly. It's just incomplete in a way that hides the part that actually forced the decision, and forced it on that specific night, at that specific hour, instead of a month earlier or a month later. Every retrospective, every anniversary broadcast, every textbook chapter frames the events of that August morning as the closing move in a decades-long ideological standoff, the physical punctuation mark at the end of a sentence about capitalism and communism. It's a tidy story. It photographs well, it gives you a clear hero and a clear villain, and it lets you walk away from the history feeling like you understand exactly why the wall existed. The wall did not go up because East Germany was losing an argument about which system of government was superior. It went up because East Germany was, in the summer of 1961, living through something that looks, once you actually follow the numbers instead of the speeches, exactly like a bank run. A currency crisis so severe, so accelerating, so visibly out of control, that within a matter of weeks the East German state was watching its economy drain out through a single open door sitting in the middle of a divided city. By the time this video is over, you're going to understand why the wall went up on a Sunday specifically, why it went up in a matter of hours rather than being announced weeks in advance, and why that timing wasn't an accident, an oversight, or a scheduling coincidence. It was the entire point of the operation. Here's what most people miss. This wasn't a political wall first. It was a monetary wall first. The politics came afterward, as the explanation everyone found easier to live with. Picture the specific street this actually happened on, because the specificity matters. Bernauer Strasse ran directly along the border, with buildings on one side sitting officially in the Soviet sector, while the sidewalk in front of their own doorsteps belonged to the Western sector. On that Sunday morning, residents woke to find soldiers bricking up the ground floor windows and doorways of their own apartment buildings from the inside, while people on the western sidewalk stood watching, close enough to speak to their neighbors, unable to do anything but watch a wall assemble itself between them in real time. Photographs from that week show people jumping from upper floor windows into nets held by West Berlin firefighters, because by the time they'd made their decision, the ground floor was already sealed. That image, a person leaping from their own home because a currency crisis had been resolved with a bricklayer overnight, is the entire story of this video compressed into a single frame. To understand why a city wall could ever function as a currency defense, you have to go back 13 years earlier, to 1948, to the moment Germany stopped having one currency and quietly, almost accidentally, ended up with two. After the war, the Western Allied powers occupying their zones of Germany introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, backed by American economic support through the Marshall Plan, and more importantly, by the beginnings of a functioning market economy that would soon be called the German economic miracle. The Soviet zone in the East responded within days, first by stamping old Reichsmarks with paper coupons, and shortly after by formalizing its own currency entirely, the Ostmark, the East German mark. On paper, in the official pronouncements of both governments, the two currencies were pegged at roughly 1-to-1. Officially, an Ostmark was worth a Deutschmark, full stop, no discussion. In practice, everyone living in Berlin understood within a few years that this was closer to a polite fiction than an economic reality. The Deutschmark could buy real goods sitting on real shelves in real shops. The Ostmark increasingly could not, because the goods behind it simply weren't there in the same quantity or quality. And here is the number this video is going to keep circling back to, the one detail worth holding on to through everything that follows. On the black market, and there was always a black market in a city split down the middle. The real exchange rate between the two currencies was nowhere near 1-to-1. By the late 1950s, it floated somewhere around 4 or 5 Ostmarks to a single Deutschmark, and on bad weeks, worse than that, everyone knew it. Nobody with any sense treated the two currencies as equivalent, no matter what the official rate said on paper. It's worth remembering how violently the two economies had already diverged by the time this crisis reached its peak. The 1948 currency reform in the Western zones wasn't a gentle administrative update. It was preceded by the Soviet response of blockading all road, rail, and canal access into West Berlin, an 11-month standoff broken only by the Berlin airlift, in which Western aircraft kept 2 million people fed and fueled by flying supplies over Soviet-controlled territory around the clock. That blockade was, in its own way, an earlier attempt to solve exactly the same problem this video is about, an attempt to force West Berlin's economy into dependency on the Soviet zone by cutting off its access to the Western economic system entirely. It failed, and its failure set the stage for everything that followed, because it proved that the western sectors of Berlin could survive as an island of hard currency inside Soviet territory, indefinitely, with enough outside support. That proof is exactly what made the following 13 years of currency arbitrage possible in the first place. In almost any other country, an imbalance like that would simply produce inflation, or a formal devaluation, or a slow-moving economic headache that a government could manage quietly, from a distance, without anyone outside the finance ministry paying much attention. But Berlin wasn't like anywhere else on Earth, because Berlin had a hole in it, a legal hole. An open, unpoliced, structurally built-in hole, sitting in the geographic middle of Soviet-controlled territory, connecting a soft currency economy directly to a hard currency one, with no fence required for German residents, no visa checkpoint, and functionally no capital controls at all. That hole had a name. People simply called it the door to the West. And every single day, for over a decade, tens of thousands of people walked straight through it, in both directions, as casually as commuters anywhere else in the world. 3 separate forces were converging on this problem by 1961, each one with a completely different reason to care about it, and none of them fully in control of how it would end. The first was Walter Ulbricht, the head of the East German state, a man whose entire political survival depended on making his half of a divided country look, at minimum, like it wasn't losing. Ulbricht's problem wasn't purely ideological. It was, underneath everything else, an accounting problem. Every trained engineer, every skilled factory foreman, every young doctor who packed a single suitcase and boarded a train to the western sectors took real productive capacity with them, training East Germany had paid to produce, now benefiting an economy on the other side of an invisible line. And East Germany's own central state bank, the Staatsbank, was watching its hard currency reserves evaporate as ordinary citizens converted savings, sold personal property for Ostmarks, and then quietly found ways to move that value westward through the one door that was still open. Less than 2 months before the wall went up, on the 15th of June, 1961, Ulbricht stood in front of international journalists and said, in words that would follow him for the rest of his political career, that nobody had any intention of building a wall. He said it plainly, on camera, to a room full of reporters who had asked him directly whether such a plan existed. It was, depending on how generously you want to read it, either a flat lie told to buy a few final weeks of calm before the operation could be executed, or the honest position of a leader who genuinely hadn't yet signed off on the specific plan sitting on his desk. Either way, the gap between that public denial and the trucks rolling out with barbed wire 8 weeks later tells you everything about how compressed and how desperate the actual decision-making timeline had become by the summer of 1961. The second force was the West German Bundesbank, and the uncomfortable truth of this story, the part that resists the easy villain narrative this channel usually likes to build toward, is that the Bundesbank barely had to do anything at all. Its entire contribution to the crisis was simply existing successfully, running a stable, convertible, steadily strengthening currency directly next door to a soft, non-convertible one. A strong currency sitting beside a weak one, with an open, walkable border between them, will pull value across that border as reliably and as relentlessly as gravity pulls water downhill. West Germany didn't need a plan to destabilize its neighbor. It just needed to keep succeeding at its own economic miracle, and the Deutschmark did the rest of the work automatically, every single day, without anyone in Bonn lifting a finger. Consider what that miracle actually looked like from across the border. By the late 1950s, West German shop windows were filling with consumer goods that simply didn't exist in equivalent quantity or quality on the eastern side of the line. Refrigerators, television sets, fashionable clothing, the first wave of what would become West Germany's reputation for automotive engineering. None of this was propaganda. It was visible, walkable, touchable, sitting in windows that East Berliners passed on their way to and from jobs on the western side of the city. Every window like that functioned as a kind of silent advertisement for the currency required to buy what was inside it, and no amount of state radio programming from East Berlin could compete with a shop window a 10-minute walk away. The Bundesbank's monetary discipline and West Germany's industrial recovery weren't a coordinated attack on the Ostmark. They were simply the market functioning exactly as markets function, and the Ostmark was on the losing side of that function every single day the border stayed open. The third force was Nikita Khrushchev, applying pressure from Moscow that had almost nothing to do with the mechanics of currency flight and almost everything to do with prestige and humiliation. In November 1958, Khrushchev issued an ultimatum, demanding that the Western powers withdraw their forces from West Berlin within 6 months, threatening that if they refused, Moscow would simply hand control of the access routes to East Germany and let Ulbricht's government decide who came and went. The ultimatum expired, the Western powers didn't move an inch, and what Khrushchev was left holding 3 years later was a client state that was hemorrhaging both people and hard currency through a border he had already tried and already failed to force closed through diplomacy alone. The stakes for Khrushchev personally were higher than they might first appear. He had staked real political capital on the 1958 ultimatum, presenting it to the Soviet Presidium and to the wider communist bloc as a decisive move that would finally resolve the awkward, embarrassing anomaly of a Western-aligned island sitting inside Soviet territory. When the Western powers simply refused to leave and called what amounted to a bluff, Khrushchev's credibility with his own allies took a real hit, and East Germany's accelerating collapse throughout 1960 and into 1961 only made that earlier failure look worse in retrospect. By the time Ulbricht and Khrushchev met in Moscow in the final weeks before the wall went up, the conversation wasn't really a debate about whether to act. It was a conversation about how to act in a way that wouldn't provoke a direct military response from the Western powers, who had troops, tanks, and a standing commitment to defend West Berlin specifically, but had never explicitly committed to defending free movement between the eastern and western sectors of a city they didn't fully control in the first place. That legal gap, subtle as it sounds, was the entire opening Khrushchev and Ulbricht needed. Sealing the border wasn't advancing into Western territory. It was simply closing a door that happened to sit entirely within Soviet-administered ground, and that distinction is precisely why the Western allies, despite their shock and their public condemnation, never seriously considered a military response. So by the summer of 1961, you have a state visibly losing its own economy in slow motion, a prosperous neighbor unintentionally accelerating that loss simply by existing, and a superpower patron who had already burned his best political card trying to solve the problem and had nothing left but the threat of force. Something had to give, and it was never going to be the Deutschmark. By June and July of 1961, the numbers had stopped looking like a slow, manageable leak and started looking like an outright rupture. Refugee crossing points across Berlin were processing people at a rate that alarmed even hardened Soviet planners who were used to thinking in terms of acceptable losses. Estimates from that final summer put the daily outflow somewhere north of 1,000 people a day, spiking past 2,000 on the worst days, with the pace visibly accelerating for a specific and almost self-defeating reason. People could feel the crisis approaching, could hear the rumors circulating about a closed border, and didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of whatever East Germany was about to do. It became a self-fulfilling emergency in the truest sense. Fear of a coming closure drove more people to leave immediately, and more people leaving immediately made the closure feel even more urgent to the people still deciding whether to act. And it wasn't only people leaving. It was value leaving alongside them, through a second channel that gets far less attention in the popular retelling. So-called border crossers, East Germans who lived in the eastern sectors but held jobs in the western ones, were earning Deutschmarks during the day and spending Ostmarks at night, effectively siphoning hard currency out of the Western economy while quietly offloading soft currency responsibility onto the eastern one. Meanwhile, ordinary savers on the eastern side, the people with no intention of leaving at all, scrambled to convert whatever Ostmark savings they held into anything, goods, foreign currency, even barterable objects, that might still hold value 6 months down the line. The Staatsbank was watching a currency defense collapse in real time, in front of its own eyes, and there was no interest rate lever available, no capital control regime already in place, no diplomatic maneuver on the table that could physically stop a person from simply walking across a street they'd walked across their entire life. By 1961, an estimated 50 to 60,000 of these border crossers, the Grenzgänger, as they were known in German, were making this exact daily journey, and East German officials had already tried, and already failed, to solve the problem administratively before resorting to concrete. Earlier that same year, the East German government had attempted to require border crossers to accept payment for their Western jobs partly in Ostmarks rather than Deutschmarks, and had floated proposals to tax their Western income more aggressively. Neither measure worked, because employers on the Western side simply paid what the labor market demanded, and workers simply found ways around whatever paperwork East Berlin invented. The lesson embedded in that failure was blunt, and in hindsight, obvious. You cannot regulate your way out of an open border. You can only close it. So on the night of August 12th into the 13th, 1961, a Saturday night sliding into a Sunday, East German authorities executed a plan that had been prepared in total secrecy for weeks, moved under cover of routine military logistics so as not to trigger the very panic it was designed to prevent. Trucks quietly delivered barbed wire and construction materials to dozens of crossing points across the city. Soldiers began cutting streets in half with coiled fencing, block by block, before residents on either side had any real chance to react. Subway lines and rail connections threading between the eastern and western sectors were suspended within hours, severed mid-route as though the city's own nervous system had been cut. Here's what most people miss about the timing, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. It was a Sunday for the same reason a failing bank prefers to collapse quietly over a weekend rather than in the middle of a business day. Banks were closed. Currency exchange windows were closed. There was no mechanism, no counter, no clerk anywhere in the city for anyone caught by surprise to convert their savings, liquidate a position, or make one final desperate crossing to move value across the line before the door slammed shut for good. Do this on a Wednesday in the middle of business hours, and you trigger exactly the kind of last-minute run you were trying to prevent in the first place: crowds at every checkpoint, chaos at every bank window, precisely the visible collapse the operation was designed to avoid. Do it in the dead, quiet hours of a weekend, and you close the door while the money is still sitting obediently inside it, with nowhere left to go. The operation itself, internally, moved with a precision that reflected weeks of planning compressed into a handful of hours. Troop and police mobilization orders went out under the cover of what looked, to any outside observer, like a routine weekend exercise. Roughly 10,000 East German police and factory militia members were positioned at crossing points across the city before midnight, with regular army units held further back as a second line in case of unrest. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the first coils of barbed wire were going up at major crossing points. By dawn, the operation had reached nearly every minor crossing as well, including footpaths, garden gates, and improvised routes through cemeteries and canal banks that Berliners had used for over a decade to avoid the more heavily monitored checkpoints. West Berlin's police and the Western Allied garrisons, deliberately kept in the dark, could do nothing but observe from their own side of a line that, legally, they had no standing to cross uninvited. By midday Sunday, tens of thousands of West Berliners had gathered near the new barriers, some shouting, some simply standing in stunned silence, watching a line that had existed only as an administrative abstraction for over a decade suddenly become physically real in front of them. Within days, that first barbed wire hardened into concrete. Within a year, it had become the wall people picture today when they hear the phrase Berlin Wall, guard towers, floodlit no man's land, a physical barrier that would stand, largely unchanged in its basic function, for the next 28 years. But the concrete came second. The currency defense came first, and it came in a single night, because a single night was the only version of this plan that could actually work. In the weeks immediately before the closure, the Western Reception Center at Marienfelde, built specifically to process the flood of arrivals from the east, was running so far past its intended capacity that families were sleeping in hallways and temporary tents while paperwork slowly caught up with the sheer volume of people arriving. Officials there had watched the numbers climb steadily for years, but the final weeks of July and the first days of August 1961 produced spikes that made even seasoned caseworkers uneasy, entire families arriving with a single suitcase between them, doctors and engineers walking in still wearing their work clothes, having simply not gone home the previous evening. It's worth sitting with the fact that the people processed through Marienfelde in early August 1961 were, without knowing it, some of the last East Germans who would ever cross that border legally and voluntarily for the next 28 years. Nobody standing in that intake line on the 10th or 11th of August had any idea they were living through the final closing hours of an open door that would not reopen in their lifetime for many of them. Here's the uncomfortable part of sealing a currency leak with concrete instead of policy. It works in the narrowest and most technical sense of the word. Once the border physically closed, East Germany's capital flight problem effectively ended within days, simply because the mechanism enabling that flight, an open, walkable door, no longer existed in any usable form. The Ostmark did not get stronger as a result. It did not suddenly acquire the backing, the productive capacity, or the convertibility that had been missing all along. It just stopped being tested against the alternative every single day by every single person who might otherwise choose differently. That isn't a solution to a currency problem. That's simply hiding the exchange rate from the only people who were ever going to reject it. And that's the pattern this channel keeps finding, in one historical costume after another, whenever we pull back the ideological framing and look directly at the ledger underneath it. When a weak non-convertible currency exists right next to a strong convertible one, and people are genuinely free to choose between them, the weak currency eventually loses. Always. The only real variable is what form that loss takes. Sometimes it looks like runaway inflation. Sometimes it looks like formal capital controls, quietly legislated rather than built out of concrete. And sometimes, if the stakes are existential enough and the political will is ruthless enough, it looks exactly like a wall running through the middle of a living city. You can still find quieter, less dramatic versions of this same logic operating today, built on precisely the same underlying arithmetic. Countries running currency pegs that no longer match economic reality, propped up long after the market has stopped believing in them. Capital controls limiting exactly how much money a citizen is legally permitted to move abroad in a given year. Even the modern, digital-era equivalents, restrictions on foreign exchange access, hard limits on international transfers, sudden banking holidays announced without warning, exist for essentially the same reason East Germany built a wall in 1961. To stop people from voting with their money before a government finds a way to stop them from voting with their feet. Argentina has closed its own version of this door more times than most of its citizens can count, tightening and loosening currency exchange restrictions, in cycles that map almost exactly onto the logic of 1961 Berlin. A soft currency losing a public argument against a harder one, with the government reaching for administrative walls instead of economic fixes. Greece, in the summer of 2015, imposed capital controls limiting how much cash its own citizens could withdraw from their own bank accounts in a single day, not because of ideology, but because the alternative was watching every euro walk out of the banking system within a matter of weeks. China has spent years managing an elaborate system of capital controls, specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of currency arbitrage this video has spent the last several minutes describing, aware that an open door between a managed currency and a freely convertible one produces the same pressure in Shanghai that it produced in Berlin. None of these are ideological arguments. They are all, underneath the press releases, the same ledger entry repeating itself in a different language. Even the collapse of the Bretton Woods system itself in the early 1970s, when the United States finally abandoned the gold-backed dollar, rather than keep defending a peg the rest of the world no longer fully believed in, follows the same underlying shape. A government can announce with total confidence that a currency is worth exactly what it says it's worth, but eventually, if enough people on the ground disagree in enough numbers with enough conviction, something has to break, either the official rate or the flow of people and money testing it. East Germany chose to break the flow. The United States, a decade later, chose to break the rate instead. Both decisions were, underneath the different outcomes, responses to the identical underlying pressure. a currency that the market had already stopped believing in, long before the government was willing to admit it out loud. The Berlin Wall gets remembered today as a monument to ideology, and in the decades after it went up, it absolutely became exactly that, a symbol invoked in speeches, photographed by visiting presidents, finally torn down on live television in 1989 as the definitive proof that one economic and political system had won and the other had lost. But on the actual night it went up, in the hours that mattered most, it wasn't a statement about which political philosophy was superior. It was an emergency monetary measure, executed by a state that had run out of every other option to keep its currency from collapsing under the weight of a door it could no longer afford to leave open. So the next time a headline crosses your feed about a country restricting how much money its citizens are allowed to send abroad, or defending a currency peg that clearly isn't holding up under any real pressure, ask yourself the same question this video keeps circling back to. Is this really about ideology, the way the official statement claims? Or is it, exactly like Berlin in the summer of 1961, simply the oldest trick available to a losing side, building a wall, because the money has already made the argument you were hoping to win and made it against you? There's a reason this reframing matters beyond simply getting the history right. If you only ever understand the Berlin Wall as an ideological monument, you walk away with a comfortable, closed lesson. One system was right, one system was wrong, the wrong one built a wall, the right one eventually tore it down, the end. But if you understand it as a currency crisis that reached for concrete because it had run out of every other option, you walk away with an open lesson instead, one that doesn't stay safely contained in 1961. You start reading currency reports and central bank statements the way this channel has trained you to read a treaty or a reparations schedule, not for what they claim to be doing, but for what they're actually protecting and from whom. You start noticing the same underlying arithmetic every time a government anywhere in the world tightens the rules on how its own citizens are allowed to move their own money. You stop asking only what a leader believes, and you start asking what their ledger actually says, because in Berlin, in the summer of 1961, the ledger said everything the speeches were carefully avoiding. If you've made it this far, you already understand something that most people who have watched a dozen documentaries about the Cold War still don't. Let me know in the comments below. Where else in the world do you think this exact same pattern is quietly playing out right now?